They checked her ID, questioned its legitimacy, and called security before realizing they were about to refuse service to someone who could end their careers in an instant. The thought had been in the back of her mind for months, a quiet thought, easy to dismiss at first, but the more she thought about it, the more it gnawed at her. Danielle Grayson had built Grayson Trust from scratch. Her bank was her legacy. She wasn't just some CEO sitting in a glass office looking out at the skyline. She'd spent years making sure her organization was distinctive, accessible, and built on fairness. But was that really the question that kept her up at night? She'd heard the whispers before, concerns about how certain customers were treated at certain branches. Nothing blatant, nothing too flashy, just heartwarming stories from friends, passing comments from people she trusted. She dismissed them at first. After all, her bank had strict policies about fair treatment, anti-discrimination, and excellent customer service. But policies were just words on a page. Real change came from action. And Danielle needed proof. She needed to know, not as a CEO, not as a boss, but as a customer. So today, she was just an ordinary woman walking into the bank, no fancy coat, no silk blouse, no designer heels, just a simple cardigan, jeans, and sneakers. She pulled into the parking lot of a Grayson Trust branch in Indianapolis, Indiana, a location she'd personally greenlit just 3 years ago. She remembered vividly shaking hands with the branch manager at the ribbon cutting, posing for pictures and giving a speech about trust as the foundation of good banking. Now she walked in as an anonymous person. The automatic doors slid open, and the fresh scent of freshly printed paper and industrial air freshener filled the lobby. She glanced around. It was a slow afternoon, a few customers in line, a couple sitting in the waiting area, and a teller at the back of the room balancing a cash drawer. Danielle adjusted her bag and walked up to the counter. A young teller, in his 20s, pale-skinned, with dark hair pulled back into a stiff ponytail, glanced at her without greeting, without a smile, just a quick glance before returning his attention to the screen in front of him. Danielle cleared her throat. "Hello, I'd like to withdraw money." The teller didn't look up, just reached for a clip. That coldness raised a suspicion in her, that perhaps the whispers she had heard were more than just passing stories. And perhaps, she was about to get the answers she sought, even if they were not the answers she had hoped for. Danielle stepped into the bank, the cool air and bright lights making her blink. She approached the counter, where a young teller was busy with paperwork. Danielle set the form down on the counter, her name carefully filled out along with the account number and amount she wanted withdrawn. $5,000 wasn't a lot of money, but it was enough for the bank to ask for ID verification. She pulled a pen from her pocket, wrote down the details, and slid the clipboard back to the teller. The teller's eyes scanned the form, then settled on Danielle. There was a momentary hesitation. I saw her brow furrow, her lips purse into a thin line. The atmosphere changed, subtly but clearly. A vague tension began to creep in. Danielle stood still, waiting, trying to stay calm and patient. The teller glanced up again, and this time really studied her face. She hesitated, longer than she should have. In that moment, Danielle knew it wasn't the amount of the withdrawal, not the bank policy, not the security. It was who they thought she was. The teller touched the keypad, but then, as if she had made up her mind, she slowly placed Danielle's ID card on the counter. But instead of continuing the transaction, she said, I'll be right back. Danielle squinted as the teller took her ID and disappeared through the door to the manager's office. She exhaled slowly, her fingers tapping lightly on the cold marble counter. She hadn't expected this. But a vague feeling in her gut told her that this was just the beginning. And Danielle wouldn't leave without an answer. She leaned lightly against the counter, her eyes following the teller's shadowy figure through the frosted glass. The tension in the lobby was thick now, as if something was unspoken but felt by everyone. Danielle glanced around. A man in business attire stood 2 seats away from her, his suit slightly wrinkled and his tie loose. He looked like he had just left the office. When he entered, the cashier greeted him immediately. Across the hall, an older woman in a floral dress was chatting happily with another clerk, without any further delay or checking. Danielle turned back to the counter, her jaw clenched. She had been standing there for nearly 5 minutes, waiting for an explanation. A delay she knew shouldn't have happened. If it had been a matter of policy, the cashier would have explained. If it had been a matter of security, she would have clarified. But no. This was different. Danielle knew that. And she wasn't going to leave without knowing why. The door finally opened. The cashier reappeared, her eyes uncertain and tense. Todd Larson strode into the scene with a quiet but unshakable confidence. He was a stocky middle-aged man with a bald head and a pair of sharp rimless glasses that added to his sharpness. His expression was polite but restrained, his eyes carefully observing every detail. On his chest, a shiny name tag read, Todd Larson. Danielle recognized the assessment immediately, the scrutinizing, weighing look she had seen many times before, but never directed at herself. Todd paused at the counter, giving her a tight-lipped smile, polite but unfriendly. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice steady and even. "I take it you're trying to back out?" Danielle nodded, keeping her gaze steady. "That's right, $5,000 from my account." Todd glanced briefly at the teller, then looked back at Danielle. "If I may see your identification." She exhaled slowly, fighting back the rising frustration. "I gave it to her." He didn't react, didn't acknowledge her. Todd simply picked up the ID card, holding it up to the light, studying every detail as if it might reveal some secret. After a moment, he looked back at her. "Miss Grayson, is this your first time doing business with us?" Danielle's stomach dropped. The question was carefully phrased, but the implication was clear, "Do you belong here?" Her voice sharpened. "I've been doing business here since this branch opened." Todd nodded slowly and dramatically, as if processing the information carefully. "And you said you wanted to withdraw $5,000. Danielle's patience was starting to wear thin. "That's what I wrote." The lobby seemed quieter. Not completely silent, but the atmosphere had changed, a few customers had begun to glance their way, sensing the tense energy. Todd turned his ID card between his fingers, then, without looking at her, asked, "And what do you do, Ms. Grayson?" Danielle let out a short laugh, not out of amusement but out of surprise at the absurdity of the question. She tilted her head, studying the executive standing before her. "I work in finance," she replied, her voice careful but meaningful. Todd's smile turned reluctant, but he didn't back down. "Oh, really? Banking?" That made him pause for a second, but instead of backing down, he pressed. "I see," he said slowly. "And this is a personal account, right? Not a business account?" Danielle folded her arms across her chest, her eyes never leaving his. "That's what it says on the form." Another slow nod, another hesitant glance at the cashier, as if Todd were coming to some invisible decision. Finally, he placed the identification card on the counter, his lips pressed together. "Unfortunately, we won't be able to process this withdrawal at this time." Danielle blinked, trying to process what she had just heard. The air around her seemed to drop, each word like a knife cutting through the tense atmosphere. Todd gave a calm, measured expression. "We can't verify the transaction." Danielle felt her pulse quicken. "What do you mean?" "You have my ID, you have my account number, what else is there to verify?" Todd clasped his hands together, his voice still calm. "It's just a precaution. We take security very seriously." "Security?" Danielle repeated, her voice sharp. "That's the word people use when they don't want to say what they really think." Danielle's fingers clenched in her palms. She knew this wasn't about fraud or banking policy. This was something else entirely. But she wasn't going to leave. Not without an answer. Todd wasn't done yet. Danielle saw it in his eyes, and she knew it was about to get worse. His next words confirmed it. "We cannot verify the transaction." Danielle's eyes flickered between Todd and the still cashier. She waited, giving them a chance to realize their mistake, to correct it. But neither of them moved. She took a deep breath, pressing her palms against the counter. "Todd," she said, her voice calm but firm. "What exactly needs to be verified?" Todd kept his hands clasped in front of him, his expression uncomfortably neutral. "Miss Grayson, withdrawing a large amount of cash requires additional security steps. We just need to confirm a few details before proceeding." Danielle raised an eyebrow, noting the slight hesitation in Todd's voice. "Just some basic account verification," he continued. "Can you tell me what the last deposit to this account was?" Danielle stared at Todd. That was not standard procedure. Security questions were normal, but not this one. Not when she had presented proper identification. She felt the weight of the moment, the unspoken challenge. Was this a test to prove her right to use her own money? Her fingers tightened on the marble counter. "I don't remember the number," she said, her voice even. "But if you check my account, like you would any other customer, you'll see all my deposits." Todd gave a small smile, but it did nothing to lighten the mood. "Of course. But for security's sake, we need to make sure the account holder can confirm certain details first." Danielle clenched her jaw, her eyes never leaving Todd. "I just gave you my ID." Her voice was low but filled with suppressed anger. Todd didn't flinch. Danielle took a slow breath through her nose, trying to calm herself. She wasn't withdrawing millions of dollars, just $5,000, a fraction of what she had in this account. "I followed protocol," she said, her voice calm but firm. "So let me ask again, what's the real issue here?" Todd's expression didn't change, still cool and professional. "We're just doing our job, Ms. Grayson." Her patience was wearing thin. "Todd," she said, her voice slow but with an undeniable weight. "If I were a man in a tailored suit, would you be asking me these questions?" The words hit home like an arrow. A glint flashed in Todd's eyes, too quick to register but undeniably there. A slight shift in posture, a slight tightening around the eyes, then just as quickly gone. His professional mask returned. "It's not about looks," he said smoothly. "It's about policy." Danielle let out a short, humorless laugh. "That's right." Todd tilted his head slightly, as if weighing his next words carefully. "Would you like to try another form of identification?" he suggested, his voice still calm. "A utility bill? A second form of ID?" Danielle couldn't help but sigh, her displeasure evident. "You want me to provide another form of ID for my own bank account? The one you're holding my money in?" Todd didn't blink. Danielle shook her head, tapping her fingernails on the counter. "Okay, let's do it another way. Open my account." Todd hesitated. Danielle continued, her voice low and firm. "You have my name. You have my ID. If you check the records, you'll see I've been doing business here since the first day I helped open this branch. I may have even signed some of your training documents." The silence stretched. Danielle leaned forward, lowering her voice just enough to make the message clear. "You should double-check, Todd, before you dig this hole any deeper." Todd's lips pressed together. The cashier beside him watched with concern, the tension building. For a brief moment, Danielle wondered if he would finally relent, if he would go back and apologize and make things right the way they should have been in the first place. Instead, Todd sighed, as if reluctantly making a decision. "I'm sorry, Ms. Grayson," he said, his voice smooth but distant. "Without further verification, we cannot process this withdrawal today." Heat rose in Danielle's chest, anger overwhelming her, but she tried to keep her composure. She knew this battle wasn't over. Danielle straightened, trying to control her breathing, but anger was boiling inside her. She could feel the eyes of the customers around her, discreet but inquisitive glances at the ongoing exchange. The atmosphere was tense, but everyone pretended not to notice. Todd's voice was polite but cool, the kind of politeness that made her understand immediately that he had no concerns about security. Instead, he had made a decision: Danielle should not be here, and nothing she said would change that. But Todd had just made a grave mistake. If he had simply processed the transaction, it would have been over long ago. But now it was different. Danielle clenched her fists, determined not to be pushed away so easily. Before she could say anything else, Todd did something that escalated the situation. He reached under the counter, pressed a discreet button, and summoned security. Immediately, a uniformed man emerged from the back office. Broad shoulders, a steely stance, hands pressed close to his waist. His expression was unreadable, but Danielle knew what this looked like. A bank manager refusing to process a customer's request was one thing, but calling security was a statement. It was a clear escalation, and it made her stomach clench. Danielle took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. She had encountered men like Todd before, men who didn't expect to be pushed back, men who saw it as their right to stop others. Some customers still pretended not to care, but Danielle knew they were listening. She lifted her chin slightly, her gaze locked on Todd. "Are you really doing this?" Her voice was sharp. Todd kept his expression carefully neutral. "We just want to ensure a smooth experience for all our customers." He sounded as if she had caused the scene. The guard stepped closer, his voice calm but not without caution. "Is there a problem here?" Danielle turned to him, her posture relaxed but her eyes unyielding. "That's up to you," she said, her voice calm. "Are you here to help me get my money or to escort me out?" The guard hesitated, glancing at Todd. Todd nodded slightly, a firm but arrogant gesture. Danielle chuckled, shaking her head. "Wow. So this is how you treat your customers?" Todd sighed, as if he were the one who had been bothered. "Miss Grayson, if you'd like to come back with additional paperwork, we'd be happy to assist you. But right now, we can't." "Can't what?" Danielle interrupted, her voice low but clear. She had made up her mind, Todd was going to regret the way he'd handled this. "You know what's funny, Todd?" Danielle said, her voice soft but cold. "I saw you process that man's transaction 10 minutes ago, no additional verification, no manager intervention, no security measures." Todd's expression hardened, but he didn't respond. Danielle stepped closer to the counter, her voice low, just loud enough for him to hear. "I wonder what's different about me." The room changed. The tension spread like a chill. The cashier looked down, avoiding eye contact. The security guard shifted his feet slightly, his posture no longer as rigid as before. But Todd was firm. "I'm sorry you feel that way, Ms. Grayson," he said evenly. "But our policy is in place for a reason." Danielle looked at him for a long moment, then slowly reached into her pocket. Todd's entire body stiffened instantly. The guard moved his hand closer to his waist, ready to act. But Danielle just pulled out her phone and started filming. A few customers turned, realizing what was happening. Todd shifted, his earlier confidence starting to falter. "Ms. Grayson, what are you trying to do?" he asked, his voice lower. "I just want to make sure I'm recording this," Danielle said softly. "That you're refusing to let me access my own account, despite providing government-issued identification, when other customers aren't required to do so." Todd's jaw clenched. Danielle turned the camera back to the guard. "And what exactly are you being called in for?" The guard hesitated, glanced at Todd, but didn't answer. Danielle remained still, her eyes fixed on them, not giving them a chance to take control of the moment. The silence was thick. And then Todd made his final mistake. He reached out, not to take her phone, but to pull her away from the counter, as if he still needed to be in control of the situation, despite everything. But that was when Danielle smiled. Todd had no idea who he was dealing with. And in 10 seconds, he would wish he had. Danielle let the moment linger, letting Todd feel the weight of his mistake. He'd taken her ID, as if he had the authority to decide what happened next, as if this was his bank. But it wasn't. This was her bank. Danielle tilted the phone slightly to make sure the camera captured Todd's face. The guard stiffened, and the tension in the air was at its peak. "Let me introduce myself properly," Danielle said, her voice unnervingly calm. Todd flinched, the first sign of uncertainty evident. She took her ID back, snatching it from his hand with ease. Her finger tapped the name printed there. "This is no ordinary customer," she said, her eyes never leaving Todd. "You're looking at the founder and CEO of Grace." The silence in the lobby changed instantly. The guard straightened. The teller's face paled. Even the customers standing nearby, pretending not to eavesdrop, stiffened. And Todd, for the first time since the confrontation began, lost control. He swallowed, his throat shaking. His lips parted, but no words came out. "I built this bank from scratch," Danielle said, each word emphatic. "I signed the approval for this branch. I personally approved the hiring budget that got you this job." Todd's entire demeanor changed. The false politeness vanished, replaced by genuine panic. "I walked in today as a regular customer, just to see what would happen," Danielle continued. "And you know what happened, Todd." He didn't answer. "I was refused service. Lied to. Humiliated. And treated like I don't belong here." Todd finally managed to get the words out. "Miss Grayson, I'm so sorry. This was just a misunderstanding." Danielle raised an eyebrow. "A misunderstanding?" "Yes, of course. I can handle your transaction right away." Danielle let the silence drag on a little longer, then finally let out a small laugh. "Todd," she shook her head. "You and I both know it's too late." And Todd paled, because he knew she was right. Danielle studied the guard for a moment, her eyes sharp but calm. She nodded, as if assessing the sincerity in his voice and eyes. Then she turned back to Todd. "So, now that we're here," she said, her tone soft but authoritative. "I want to know exactly what you plan to do next." Todd opened his mouth, but no words came out. His face paled, and his eyes darted away. The manager who had politely but casually dismissed her 5 minutes ago no longer had any confidence left in him. His hand still gripped the counter, as if it was the only thing keeping him from collapsing. "Miss Grayson," Todd began, his voice hoarse. I'm really sorry, I told you, I don't need an apology," Danielle interrupted, her voice cold. "I need action." "So, Todd. What are you going to do to fix this?" The air in the lobby seemed to freeze. The customers around them stopped pretending to be busy. They were all listening. The cashier who had caused it all remained silent, his eyes glued to the register, as if hoping that would make him invisible. The guard shifted slightly, as if preparing to intervene if the situation escalated. But his gaze was no longer hard, it was hesitant and confused. Danielle noticed this, and she decided to try one last time. "I suggest," she said, turning to the guard, "that you think very carefully about what you're doing. If you still think it's your job to get me out of here, then go ahead. But if you realize that this isn't right at all, then stand on the side of justice." The guard swallowed, glanced at Todd, then back at Danielle. Then, slowly, he took a step back, as if declaring that he wouldn't intervene. Todd looked as if he were about to faint. "Miss Grayson, please, no," Danielle said, her voice softer now, but no less firm. "You had your chance to handle this properly, and you chose not to. Now, I get to decide what happens next. And I promise you, your day is only getting worse." Danielle walked into the bank with her usual confidence, but that confidence quickly turned to disappointment when things didn't go as she expected. She knew exactly what was going on, and when Todd tried to blame someone else, pretend it was just an overreaction, Danielle wasn't surprised. That was how he always did it, avoid responsibility, try to keep things quiet. But this time, things weren't going to go away that easily. With a hard look, Danielle opened her purse, pulled out a business card, and slid it gently across the counter toward Todd. "Here's what's going to happen," she said, her voice calm but sharp. "You're going to call my office, schedule a meeting with the company, and explain in detail why this is happening today." Todd took the card, his fingers shaking slightly. "Of course, Ms. Grayson," he stammered, a forced smile on his tense face. Danielle turned to the guard standing nearby. "I appreciate you stepping in when called," she said evenly, "but I would advise you to be more careful about situations that actually require your involvement. If the customer isn't being disruptive, then the first step shouldn't be to threaten." The guard nodded slightly, his face full of guilt. "Understood, ma'am." Danielle then turned to the cashier, who was still trying to appear invisible. "And you," Danielle said, her voice calm but firm. The cashier flinched, her eyes widening as Danielle continued, "You saw my ID, you had my account information, and you still decided I wasn't worth listening to. So maybe you should ask yourself why this procedure seems to only apply to people like me." The cashier swallowed, her eyes downcast, her face flushed with embarrassment. Danielle scanned the room again. The tension was so thick it was almost suffocating. All the customers were watching, all the clerks had heard. This was no longer a small matter, it was something bigger, something more serious. With shoulders straight and a determined gait, Danielle stepped away from the counter, her heels clicking on the polished tile. No one moved, no one said a word. Todd stood still, his business card still clutched in his hand. The teller looked as if he wanted the ground to swallow him up, and the guard fumbled, clearly unsure of his actions. When she reached the door, Danielle stopped, turned around, and said one last thing, her voice full of emotion but not lacking in determination. "I've spent years building this bank into a place where people feel safe, respected, and valued. But today, I was reminded that policies on paper mean nothing if they are not implemented with fairness and humanity." And with that, she walked out of the bank, leaving a heavy silence and thoughtful glances behind. Danielle stood still in the middle of the room, her eyes scanning every face. The tension in the air was so intense that she could almost hear every heartbeat. She took a slow breath, trying to calm herself. And then, in a clear, steady, unmissable voice, she announced, "This is the last time anything like this will happen in my bank." The weight of her words filled the room. Todd flinched, the teller shifted in his seat. The guard looked down, not daring to say a word. But Danielle was not done. "I will not stand by while customers are treated differently because of assumed favoritism or simple ignorance." Her voice was low, but each word was sharp and resonant. Everyone listened in silence. "There will be changes," she said, her voice firm. "Real change. Because if this can happen to me, the CEO, I can only imagine what it will do to those who don't have the power to push back." The conference room fell silent. Todd swallowed, his throat rising and falling visibly. "Ms. Grayson, I assure you," "Don't assure me," Danielle interrupted, her voice steady. "Show me." Todd's mouth closed immediately. Danielle glanced at her phone, saw that the recording was still active. She turned it off, shoving the device back into her pocket. "The company will be in touch," she said shortly. She turned to Todd, her gaze determined. "And Todd, you may want to start looking for a new job." She didn't wait for a response. Her footsteps left the room, leaving the silence and the aftermath in her wake. The very next morning, Danielle called an emergency meeting with the company's leadership team. Every branch manager was required to be present. Customer service policies were overhauled. Todd left the bank, but that was just the beginning. Danielle implemented mandatory bias training for all branches. A new accountability system was introduced, encouraging customers to report any discriminatory behavior, no matter how small. Within weeks, change began to show. There was increased kindness and awareness. Customers who had been ignored or dismissed now saw the difference. And Danielle, she will never forget that day at the bank. Because it was proof of what she has always believed, real change doesn't come from fancy words or promises on paper. It only happens when someone is brave enough to stand up and refuse to accept injustice. And that day, that person was her. If you've ever been in a situation like this or know someone who has, don't stay silent. Speak up, call out injustices, and most importantly, demand change. Because the only way things will get better is when we refuse to accept anything less.